Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Som TV podcast. My name is Jason Wise. Glad to have you with us today. On today's pod, we're going to do sort of a one for us, but it's one of those rare confluences where something I love to talk about, which is movies, smashes headlong into wine. And we're going to talk about Francis Ford Coppola selling his winery, which was announced in 2021, the Coppola wine brand, and what he chose to do with that money, which is gamble it all on one of the most ambitious films anyone has ever made. And so I'm in my element here, wine and movies together. On today's podcast, I'm going to have my lead editor, Sarah Morgan Hall, who has edited the latest Som film, Cup of Salvation, and more wine content than probably anyone else on earth on the podcast, as well as Armin Khachaturian, who is the sales director at Morley Family Vineyards in Napa, to talk about Coppola. Before we do that, I do want to tell everybody, go to somtv.com. That's where you can find over 500 hours of original content, including our new films, and our brand new film, The Lost Winery, edited by Sarah, who's on the podcast. It is about an incredible structure that was lost during the glass fire and the effects that has on the Napa Valley. So it's a really, really poignant, great personal story. So go to somtv.com to get that. So Sarah, I am honored to have you on this pod because my whole life I have just wanted to talk about Francis Ford Coppola on a podcast. And we sort of just decided today's the day, you know? It's like a present almost. For me, at least.
I'm really happy for you, Jason. I'm happy for you.
Well, it's your first time. It's your first time on the podcast, and it's as a filmmaker yourself, it's unique that we work in wine and yet we work in film, and I'm not sure which one more. And Coppola is an interesting cat because he's sort of, I would say, arguably the most famous wine world filmmaker there is, without a question.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. Can you name another wine world filmmaker besides Jason Wise?
Yeah, well, I don't own a vineyard or a winery, so I don't know that I'm in the same category. There are several Italian directors. Yeah, there are several Italian directors that would be pretty geeky to name. It's a really good question. You know, there's some screenwriters that have gone on to have some vineyards and such, but nothing on the level of Coppola. Not where if you're not into movies and you've never heard of The Godfather, I don't know who this person is, but if you've never heard of these films, you've never heard any of this, you've heard of Coppola's wine. You know, you've been at a restaurant, you've seen Coppola Merlot, or you've been to a grocery store and just passed by it, or you know of Inglenook, which he's owned for quite a while. Him and his family are monolithic, and especially does not get enough credit for building up Napa. He was one of the very first people to be talking about Napa on the level of the great Italian regions and France and stuff. So this is like a great geeky thing. But to set this all up, all right, Sarah, and you cut me off if I get a little too geeky or I go too big here. There is this film coming. It's called Megalopolis. And no, I did not come up with that name via like an AI prompt. It is called Megalopolis, and it is Francis Ford Coppola's lifetime dream. He came up with this film in the mid-70s, and it is about the destruction of a city that's getting rebuilt in a modern way. And he's tried to make it over and over and over again. It's way too expensive, way too grand. And so when the announcement came that Francis Ford Coppola sold the Coppola brand wine to a winery group, it was kind of like, wow, all right, he's getting older. I guess he needs the money. But he's not the kind of guy that does that kind of stuff. He's got a big family. They all have grand ambitions. His daughter's one of the great filmmakers working today. It just had this air of why? Why did he sell this brand that's doing so well? And then, of course, the news came out that he was going to make Megalopolis, which is a reported $120 million film, the largest self-financed independent film in the history of cinema. And it probably costs considerably more than that, counting that most times you hear a budget, it's often lower than what it really is. And so, you know, this is the first time I've seen somebody who takes a giant chip, which is their wine brand. Now, he didn't sell Inglenook, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but he did sell the Coppola brand name, which has huge market penetration. And he bet it all on this crazy dream that he's had as a filmmaker. And I'm not Coppola, but everyone I know that has made films, makes films, has this film they want to make. I mean, I have that film. Everyone has this film. And it's rare that you get to actually see it get made, because normally those films are so crazy. I want to ask you, as a filmmaker first, what is your relationship with Coppola? Francis Ford Coppola. When you hear that name, what comes to your mind?
Hearts of Darkness, which is a documentary that was made about the making of Apocalypse Now. It's one of the best documentaries ever made, ever. and is an incredible look into the post-production process and the production process, of course. That's what I think of.
That is a top 2 documentary for me.
Yeah, for sure.
Let's talk about that, because we're going to do a little bit on Coppola's career and his risk, but let's talk about that particular film. Why do you think of that film when you think of Coppola? Why not The Godfather? Why not something else? Why a making of documentary about his movie?
That's true. I mean, I think that's just the one that sticks. I mean, feel like Godfather and Coppola are synonymous, or like they're just completely connected. That's just like the number one. But for me personally, that's what I think about, is getting to see the process. That's like one of my favorite things, is what is an artistic process, all the logistics and emotions and blood, sweat, and tears that go into creating something. And that is truly mythical. Apocalypse Now is mythical in filmmaking for the complete disaster. And then the truly transcendent work of art that was created out of that. And there's a lot of mythologizing about tortured artists and having to suffer to create, that I think is, not required or healthy, really.
Now you tell me?
Definitely has made, it's influenced, its influence cannot be measured probably on filmmaking. But I do think it's interesting that Coppola, what I've learned is I think what people might not know, is that he's almost always been a kind of anti-Hollywood guy. Even though he's made all these Hollywood movies, before he made The Godfather, he tried to make his own studio. He was like, we don't need you, Hollywood. We're going to try to do this ourselves.
Why don't we go through his career a little bit? Because I think it's important for people to understand his collision with wine is the same as his collision with movies. I mean, these are the two things that this person felt the most passionate about. And it's really important when we get to The Godfather and Apocalypse Now. There are some very important wine scenes in those films. In Apocalypse Now, one was cut, and I'm going to talk about those really quick. So just hang with me, everyone listening that's in the wine world. He started in 1963 with his first film, which is a horror film called Dementia 13. This guy worked in the most independent of independent films with a guy named Roger Corman, who is the grandfather of all independent cinema. This guy is one of the most important figures in the history of movies, but also in independent films. And he started the careers of some of the greatest directors alive, including Martin Scorsese, Jonathan Demme. The list goes on and on and on of the people in the late 60s and the early 70s that this person, Peter Bogdanovich, you could just go on and on and on and on and on. So he made this first film. So his foray into cinema was not through the Hollywood system. It was through, I have $80,000. We have an old house, write a script. You have 1 week to shoot the whole film, and here's some actor that hasn't worked in 20 years, but we got them. And it was basically a DIY, how do I make a film? And Dementia 13 was successful, especially for the time. They were running a lot of drive-through movies, and it was a good movie. So then he gets this job writing a script called Patton off of General Patton. And this is famous because Coppola has begun to establish himself as he wants to make films his way or the highway. And when he makes Patton, he writes this script, and he has a lot of disagreements with the producers. And he's working with a very big Hollywood studio. It's his first time he worked with a major studio. And he disagrees, and they fire him. But he had finished the script, turned it in. So Coppola, trying to provide for his young family, gets a job fixing editing machines. So these moviolas are these machines where you would cut and snip actual celluloid and snip them together. And he's repairing one, and he's looking at somebody editing the room, and he goes, what are you working on there? This is like lore of Hollywood. How true this ultimately is, who knows? And while he's working on it, they're cutting Patton. And he goes, I wrote that, and packs up his gear and leaves. And supposedly that's how it goes. And then he wins the Oscar for this script. And this thus begins the lore of Francis Ford Coppola as a filmmaker. And he's been able to mythologize his own mythology more than almost any filmmaker before or since. You sort of think about Francis Ford Coppola, and you think about it's like this myth making. And then the true stories are crazier than the stuff that you think might not be true. And so just to go through really fast, he gets The Godfather, which he was like the 10th or more director they asked to do it. Everybody said, no, for a million reasons. It's going to be too expensive. Don't want to do it. Don't want to do this. Don't want to do that. And that story, you could do 10 podcasts on The Godfather. But when he does that, And it explodes and basically is the precursor for the blockbuster. Everyone credits Jaws and everyone credits The Exorcist and all these films. But the truth is, The Godfather set up this thing where lines were around the block for 6 months. And it really was such a smash that he got to do whatever he wanted. So he goes through this quick career, and I'm going to run through this if you've ever heard of these films. In between The Godfather 2, he makes a film called The Conversation, which is one of my absolute favorites with Gene Hackman. He writes the script for The Great Gatsby, which is Robert Redford, Mia Farrow vehicle. Very popular film at its time. He's so prolific in doing all this. Then he makes Godfather 2. And obviously, if you've seen the Godfather films, you know there are very famous wine scenes. There's a lot of wine. There's cooking with wine. There's a lot of Italian wine. And he does it with an authenticity that a lot of people don't do. And if you've listened to previous podcasts, we're always bitching about wine being done wrong in movies. Well, Coppola is kind of unassailable. And where our conversation about wine and his risk in films really starts is Apocalypse Now, a somewhat borderline disastrous movie that somehow found a way to recover, that was filmed in the Philippines and has a scene in it in the longer version that you could finally see when they did a long version in this French plantation. And there is extreme lengths given to the temperature that the wine should be served at. I mean, he is a crazy wine guy. And when the whole thing blew up, he traveled to his estate in Napa, which he had bought with the money from Godfather 2. So he had to lay low there when everything blew up and typhoons ruined all the sets and terrible things had happened to the production. And then that film ends up being a success. But it was, Sarah, I'm correct me if I'm wrong, but there were tens of millions of dollars at risk of his own money in Apocalypse Now when it was released.
I mean, his quote is, "We were in the jungle."
Yes.
Yeah. He says it can because it played at Cannes, right? It played at Cannes.
Yep.
And then he says,
right.
"We were in the jungle. We had access to too much money, too much equipment, and little by little we went insane."
It's true. And so that's at the first screening. No one had even seen the damn movie at this point.
He's still insane from it. He's still recovering.
So you would think somebody who went through mortgaging their house, mortgaging their land, mortgaging their sanity would never do this kind of thing again. And then a couple years later, he makes a film called One from the Heart. And this is probably one of the most interesting little-known stories in the history of Hollywood. It is a horrible bomb. It is considered one of the biggest bombs in the history of movies, and it ruined him financially. It bankrupted him. He lost almost everything he had, and it wasn't until Bram Stoker's Dracula that he was able to recoup. The reason we're telling this whole story, and the reason I am pontificating so much about Coppola, aside from the fact that I love him, admire his career, admire him as a filmmaker, is that when that sale happened of the wine, there just had to be something attached to it. You knew it wasn't like, I just want to be more comfortable. This is not a guy who has lived to be comfortable, and he's found a way to rebound every time. But he had this Coppola brand with immense market penetration. And so I want to go to a conversation I had briefly with Armin Khachaturian, who knows everybody up in Napa and has met Francis Ford Coppola several times. And I want to talk to him about what the Coppola brand and what this sale means. And then we're going to come back and talk about Megalopolis. What can you tell me about when Francis Ford Coppola got into wine commercially?
So 1975, after the success of The Godfather, Francis Ford Coppola buys a portion of the Inglenook property, 1,100 acres at that time, for $2.2 million. If you look historically, Gustav Niebaum had the property purchased and, it expanded at one point. It was like 1,600, 1,700 acres. His great-grandson, John Daniels Jr., was making wine from 39 till 64, considered some by the best vintages of Inglenook. They sold that property in 65 to United Vintners. United Vintners sold the property to Hubline Spirits. People are like, what's Hubline Spirits? You know them better as Smirnoff Vodka.
Wow.
And the property didn't really make great wines again until Coppola bought it. But when he bought the property in 75, he bought everything except a chateau. That was done in 95 after the success of Bram Stoker's Dracula.
It's so great how this is all tied. I mean, Godfather 1 and 2 being one step, and then Bram Stoker's Dracula, which, I could do 2 hours on what that meant for his career and the fact that he rebounded and fixed some past things with that film. But So Bram Stoker, he takes the profit from that and he buys all of it. That's when he owns everything, right?
No, that's when he buys the chateau. Truly, if you want to say when did all of it come together, it was in 2011 when he acquired the Inglenook brand and trademark. Okay. That was the big part. So it took him almost 4 decades of going back and forth. What's also fascinating is there's a historic vineyard, J.J. Cohen, which now people refer to as Scarecrow. Exactly. And I think there's like 140, 150 acres. That was purchased by Coppola, and then part of it was sold back to the family, which is where Scarecrow comes from. Scarecrow isn't part of 140 acres. It's tiny. But Inglenook was buying fruit from J.J. Cohen's property for a number of years in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And so it took Mr. Coppola over 4 decades to do this all. Fascinating thing was in the 70s, in 75 when he bought the property, the reason he bought it in the 60s when it was sold, a huge portion, like over 1,000 acres was bought by a developer who's going to develop a golf course out there. And Napa Ag finally said no, and then they put it in preserve. So a lot of that acreage today is in Napa Valley Ag Preserve.
That's incredible. I mean, could you imagine playing golf on the spot that, Inglenook and some of those, some of the wines that are grown on that place, they'll go for $1,000 a bottle. I mean, it's insanity to even think about having a caddy on that land.
Yeah. So well, and what's funny is there was a golf course on the other side of the valley in the 60s and 70s. I think even through the 80s in what's present-day Stags Leap District.
Okay. Wow.
That they obviously planted vineyards at some point. Golf was a thing that people thought Napa Valley would be golf, but luckily it didn't, and wine became what Napa Valley is known for. But when you look at Inglenook, really from 39 till 64, people will argue were the historic vintages when John Daniels Jr. was making the wines back then. I've had a number of those bottles. A lot of them were individual lots, which when you drink the bottle, you look and it says lot, H12, and you don't really understand what that's for, but they had a lot of individual small lots that they had done. But really the estate bottlings of Cabernet were the fascinating ones. And I remember my wife and I, we met a sommelier in London, and his first trip out to Napa, his palate and his experience was all old world wines. And he came out to Napa and we took him to a couple of historic properties. And at dinner, I had a bottle of 64 Inglenook Estate. And I took it out and he tasted it. And I saw the change in his eyes where he started to take Napa Valley seriously. Because he said, if Napa Valley could do this in 64, imagine what Napa Valley can do today.
Coppola was absolutely ahead of the curve when it comes to, he was right at that time when, Judgment of Paris and all the things are starting to ramp things back up to turn it into the monumental thing that it is now. But so when the Coppola brand, Coppola wines, because when I was bartending, Coppola Merlot was like our Merlot we poured. If somebody wanted a Merlot, we poured Coppola Merlot. Of course, I was in film school during and after this one, bartending. And so for me, I'm starting to work on this little film some. I'm thinking there might be a time I get to meet this guy just because I might make a wine film. And I have met him. I wish the story was good, but basically I wanted him to be in a film and wanted to interview him and tell a story. And of course, he wanted a ton of money just to sit down and talk to me. And that's where it ended because I have never had a ton of money. But basically, it did go to that. What's the reputation of the Coppola brand in Napa? And I mean pre-sale, he sold this whole brand. What do people think of him?
Well, people love him and his wife, Eleanor. They were very loved, right? I was at a friend's house, back in, 10, 15 years ago, Robert Parker would come and do these big tastings with different distributors. At the end of the tasting, you have all these open bottles. All the vintners would get invited and we'd all sit around and open these bottles. And I remember Francis Ford Coppola came, he had a hat on, he sat in the corner, he had a glass of wine. I went, said a few words to him. He was the nicest guy in the world. If you didn't know who he was, you would just think he's someone's grandpa or uncle just hanging out. He was so chill. I can't imagine him saying, give me a lot of money for an interview. He'd be like, yeah, sure, I'll talk to you, whatever. I mean, that's how cool he was. Really humble. I think the people in Napa really love what he did for that property, historically speaking, being able to piece that property. I don't know anyone else who'd be able to piece that property back together because the people he bought those vineyards from, that land from, would never sell to anyone else because they knew historically he would keep it all together. Mm-hmm. And the quality of wines, we wine tasted at Inglenook back in the day, when they were doing Rubicon and stuff, and the wines were really good. Recently they've gotten better. They've hired, a French winemaker from France who comes out, and the quality of wines is pretty great.
So as far as like the Coppola brand, I mean, I know the answer to this, but I just want to hear in Napa, like what's the status of that? Like, what is it? Is it just considered your sort of everyday wine? I'm talking the Coppola. You had like the director's cut cab.
Yeah, they had
like the Merlot,
they had the two levels.
Pinot.
Sure, all those were solid wines. Every day, every person wines. You can find them in grocery stores. You can find them in wine shops. They had a separate level of wines that were really high quality wines. But, not to say that grocery store wines are bad. In fact, if you are studying for the WSET3 or diploma, the one thing they do is they have to be wines that are accessible. So they have to be wines that are found at grocery stores. When you're studying for WSET3 diploma MW, it's not about Grand Cru Burgundy and First Growth Bordeaux. It's about everyday wines that are accessible to everyday people. In respect to that, the Coppola wines, the director's cut, the black label, all those were great wines for what the wines were. But I wouldn't say those wines were collectible. I mean, people who have wine cellars weren't collecting director's cut. But
it must have been worth a fortune, because I can tell you, as we'll get to here later in the pod, like, he's able to finance his dream project he's been talking about since post Godfather 2, this film called Megalopolis, which, one of the biggest gambles I think anyone's ever taken, and he's gambled everything. It's a wild thing. Thank you, Armin. I appreciate it. It's good to get some insight on this. So, I mean, as a wine brand, obviously this was very important, but for Coppola, I think the way he's always sort of seen things is everything is at the service of him. You talk about that artistic and creative process, Sarah. I don't know that he would know how to do it without struggle, which is what we're about to get into, which is Megalopolis, which neither of us have seen.
Yeah.
But for a wine to fund a film,
I can't wait.
I mean, this is insane. I mean, I've never heard of wine funding a film.
Well, he also owns like a lot of hotels, restaurants all over the world. So he, when the first time I heard of Megalopolis was a 2019 GQ profile of him that was for the 50th anniversary of The Godfather. He was able to do a bunch of press for the 50th anniversary of The Godfather, and this long GQ profile of him was where the first time I had heard him talking about Megalopolis. And the name of the article is Francis Ford Coppola's $100 million Bet. It's by Zach Barron. It is such an amazing profile.
Good writer.
But
Zach Barron.
he's so good. It's so good. This is where the first time I heard of it, and he comes out and asks him, like, this is a huge risk. You're going to you spend all this money. And he kind of says, like, it's not that important to me. Like, the money just is not important to me. He says, I've already bequeathed a bunch of stuff to my kids. I'm very comfortable. I have this Inglenook estate. This is where I live. And in fact, at the end of the article, he describes how Coppola is like building fermenters, different fermenters for each block of his winery, which is like, I don't know. I mean, it just seems totally wild. But that was in 2019. So I don't know, that was before the sale actually went through. So who knows what changed between then and now.
Oh, well, I know what changes. The film got more expensive than $100 million for sure.
Yep. Yeah.
It's really key to think about somebody who's like, the money doesn't mean much to me. Now, you hear that from people with money, but not understanding true loss. Now, this guy has truly lost everything. And I mean, before he had restaurants around the world, he's gone down to like, I might have to sell my car, from being like worth tens of millions of dollars, just previously. And then he's able to find a way, he always has been able to, but he's gone through that. So now for him to do, and maybe you're right, maybe he has so much additional assets, so much additional money, he's at this point in life that maybe you're right. 100 million isn't, 120, 150 million isn't important. But
I really do think that, like, to us, that sounds like an absolutely googly-eyed amount of money, like just like make up a number. Numbers are absolutely meaningless, that this guy can just like come up with $100 million of his own money. But it really does seem that to him, the stakes are not about the money. It seems to him the stakes are about what he has created artistically. Because what he says in this article, especially in this GQ article, when he first starts really talking about, like, I'm going to do it, I'm going to make Megalopolis. He's been talking about doing this for 30, 40 years. I found an article from 2001 that was like, he's going to do it. You know, it's 24 years ago that he's been talking about doing this. And he has put so much thought and time into this that I feel like he's putting like a lot of pressure on himself to make like the best movie ever made, which is just an impossible bar to set for yourself. And it also creates a lot of like, I think there are some people who maybe would like to see it fail. There are some people who like enjoy seeing what's going on with it because of just the gossip and the mess. There have been all these rumors that the production was fraught and he had to fire some people, like his entire art department halfway through production.
Yeah, some people.
Like for him, so I think for him, I don't know. I don't know. I want him to be happy. I want him to be happy with his output. And I know that there are going to be people that are going to measure the success of this based on whether or not it makes the money back. And I think the chances of it making the money back are very low. I think we just, based on the world, the shifting entertainment industry in general, the chances of it making its money back are extremely low, but I don't think that's what's important to him. I just don't think that's what the most important thing to him, and that's why he's the best. That's why I'm a huge fan.
I'm an enormous fan. There is no filmmaker ever to walk the earth with the higher highs and the lower lows than him. And even his lows, I mean, he's made some films where it's like, oh, okay, you know, he's taken some paycheck jobs too. He's an interesting guy.
Exactly, like, for sure.
You know, you don't see, like, Scorsese doesn't have that in his filmography. You're probably going to kill me here, but I see a lot of parallels between winemaking and filmmaking. I always have said this, that they take a very long time, way more time than it even seems, even to yourself, because you get an idea, you start thinking about it. And so even if I got hired as a director to make a film, somebody else has been thinking about that for a very long time and working on it. So for like my films, and I go on these podcasts and I'm like, this took me 7.5 years. It took me 8 years. That's not uncommon. It may not be that common to film for that long, but for a film to take 7, 8, 10, 12, 15 years, it's not uncommon. I mean, there are a lot of movies. I mean, take the new Dune films that have come out. I mean, those were in production, they're in pre-production and then would get canceled. And it took them, since David Lynch's film and before that, 20 years trying to figure out how are we going to make Dune.
And that's an adaptation. That's not even writing something original. And that's Coppola's thing, is like, he wrote this thing. He has an anecdote that he said sorry to interrupt your wine story.
Sure. No,
he has an anecdote.
Okay.
Always interrupting a wine story. But he has an anecdote that he stood holding 130 pages of blank paper, which he had typed on the front of it, Francis Ford Coppola's Megalopolis. I keep mispronouncing it. He stood there holding 103 pages of blank paper and basically made a promise to himself, like, I'm going to do it. And he did it!
Yeah, you did it. I can't wait for the movie. In wine-like filmmaking, if you're going to try to do something that is, maybe you're either going to reinvent the wheel or you're going to try to make the wheel perfect. You got to have a prize fighter mentality. You got to think, I'm the only one that can do this. I'm the best. I'm the toughest. I can run up that mountain and stand with my arms raised. Because if you don't believe that way, you're never going to be able to accomplish something so crazy. But if you have that attitude and you don't accomplish it, then as an artist, it's the ultimate fear. It's the ultimate keep you up at night. You said you were going to do something amazing. You did something and it wasn't. And holy shit. And no matter what, you worked hard. You can only imagine how much work this is.
I mean, no matter what, like, I feel like there is a world where where I wish and hope that he can be happy with what he's created. And by all his reports, he says, this is the best shooting experience I've ever had. I love my cast. This dude is a theater kid. Okay, he is a theater kid. And he said that when he came to Hollywood, he was disappointed it wasn't quite like the theater troupe he was hoping to join. You know, Hollywood's full of theater people, but they're not. It's so much of it is about the economics.
I want to read the cast for Megalopolis. I just got to do this.
Yeah.
I just got to do this. And I know, look, if you're a wine person, you stuck with this pod this whole time. Thank you very much, Mom, because I know you're still listening. But it really is. This is one of these things that in the end, I'm going to ask everyone, go to the grocery store, get a bottle of Coppola Cab. If you want to splurge, get the director's cut cab or whatever. And then hold on to it. Because when Megalopolis, whether you decide not, from what I gather, you need to see it on a huge screen. So hopefully you could sneak this bottle into the theater. If you end up seeing it at home, drink the bottle, and I'm going to ask you, what would you rather have? That wine or this film? Because that wine funded this film. So listen to the cast of this movie. Adam Driver, Giancarlo Esposito, Aubrey Plaza, Shia LaBeouf, Jon Voight, Jason Schwartzman, Talia Shire, who is Adrian in Rocky and in the Godfather movies, and also Coppola's sister, Grace Vanderwall, Lawrence Fishburne, Dustin Hoffman. I mean, it just goes on and on and on with like some of the greatest A-list stars and people he's worked with in his career and family members. I mean, Jason Schwartzman is his sister's son. Just an insane cast.
Yeah, Natalie Emmanuel, I think, is she's the lead woman. I'm worried for him. I want him to be happy. I want him to feel like he did a good job. But the problem is he said, years ago that he wants this movie to be like It's a Wonderful Life, and that people are going to come back and watch it. He literally said that people will watch it every year around New Year's forever. Like, he's really set himself up to have that as his sort of measure of success, which is an insanely high bar for anyone to set for himself. But he's asking super interesting questions. Like, he says he wants people to leave this movie thinking, is the society we have the one that it has to be? Or can we create another society? He says, what is utopia? And can we create it for ourselves? And I just love this shit. I'm just like, yes.
Simple questions. Really simple questions.
Big, huge questions and get in there. And you're right, though. It's the problem with it being coming off as pretentious. Or that it's, yeah.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of wine labels that are incredibly pretentious. And you taste the wine, you go, all right, that's good. There's a lot of films like his previous Apocalypse Now. If you just look at that on paper, you go, who would have the audacity to enter the hearts of men and figure out how deep and terrifying somebody's fears and all that stuff could be, and then relate that to our political and country's like emotional health and all of these things, and then put it in the setting of Vietnam, where all that strife, that is like, you're doomed. And then he premiered it at Cannes, and it worked. And it's like, didn't just work. It's legendary. One of the greatest films of all time ever made.
He himself has made the parallels between Megalopolis and Apocalypse Now. It's not just other people kind of forcing this on him. He himself has made his own comparisons about like, this was something that, it was very complicated, and it was hard for him initially to get the funding for Apocalypse Now, is my understanding, or at least the way that he says it. He says he came in after doing Godfather 2, and he's like, this is what I want to do. And they're like, that's crazy.
I'm gonna throw a parallel here that wine people are either gonna love or hate. Right now, there's independent wine.
Yeah.
But it's disappearing, guys. I mean, like, there are 5 companies up in Napa that are buying up every one of these families, small. And it's kind of the same thing. The industry that I am part of, which is whatever. We are an independent company that makes movies and makes shows. Tiny. But we try to make our stuff as big as possible. There are a lot of wineries with the same thing. And if you look at Napa in the United States, it's really hard to exist as a small independent thing. And Coppola, I think it's interesting that when his brand got so big that it almost was like, Coppola wine brand's pretty big. He sold it and kept Inglenook, which is this prestige, important, smaller, type of thing, which is more in his independent, smaller type of like art-driven thing. And I just, I find the parallels interesting, but the thought of wine funding cinema's riskiest film is something that I couldn't not talk about on this pod. And as we know, it's, it's premiering, depending on when this airs, it could have just premiered at Cannes or is about to. And the first words are coming out about Megalopolis. So grab your Coppola Merlot.
And if people are saying it's bad, it's okay, because he did it. I desperately want it to be good. I desperately want it to be good. I am hoping it's good. I want it to be good so bad, but we're all a little bit nervous. I think everybody's a little bit nervous that it can't possibly live up to his expectations.
all of you listeners who tell me you hate point scores with wine and you're like, yeah, point scores are bullshit. Point scores are bullshit. Well, so are reviews. So go and see this movie. I don't know why I'm plugging this film other than like, we need people to take big swings. It's not like it's going to be on Sound TV or something like that, but we need people to take big swings in wine and in art, which sometimes are the same. Sometimes it's just a product, and that's okay. But go and see Megalopolis, everybody. I don't know what else to say. Anyway, Sarah, it is great to have you on. I look forward to drinking a few glasses with you and watching Megalopolis, because we've been talking about this movie now for a long time.
Yes. We should do it. I can't wait to see it. I'm so excited.
Thanks for being on the pod, and thank you to anybody who's actually made it this far, listening to me rant about Apocalypse Now and all of this crazy stuff. I hope all of you enjoyed today's podcast. I want to thank John Adams, who produced this episode, Sarah Morgan Hall for joining, and Armin Kachtorian for joining as well. Don't forget to go to SomTV.com and subscribe, where you can watch Cup of Salvation. You can watch our new documentary, The Lost Winery, and so much more. Everybody, have a glass and be safe. Talk soon.